So now we'll begin with 1.2 as my computer begins to load up, hopefully. Welcome. I know that these take some time, but I'm aware that the best way to go through learning logic is through repetition, repetition, repetition. So we're still in Chapter 1, working on basic concepts, and we're in fact actually in 1.2, recognizing arguments. Okay? And so we're going to begin by distinguishing arguments from non-arguments, doing a certain set of problems, then looking at the difference between arguments and loosely stated statements and reports, then expository passages and illustrations, then explanation and conditional statements, and then necessary and sufficient conditions. That'll be enough for being able to distinguish arguments from non-arguments. When Wooden looks at the history of philosophy, the attempt has always been, from Plato on forward, to differentiate what philosophy is. And one main distinguishing characteristic of philosophy is that philosophy gives arguments, it does not give opinions, it doesn't give explanations, it doesn't merely give conditional statements, it doesn't just give loosely associated statements and reports, and so on. In other words, we're doing something different. And so when people see me, and they'll say, well, I have in a class or what have you, and say, well, I have an opinion, and I say, well, in philosophy we have arguments, okay? And so we'll go over that in this section today. So this section introduces methods for distinguishing arguments from non-arguments. Not every passage in ordinary language contains an argument. Hence, to apply logic to ordinary language, you must be able to distinguish arguments from non-arguments. Every argument offers evidence or reasons that are claimed to support something or to prove something. In deciding whether evidence or reasons are given in support of something, look for premises and conclusion indicators, which you learned in 1.1, an inferential relationship among the statements. One leads to another, and then look for whether something is a typical kind of non-argument. So of course, a premise or conclusion indicator may be there, and it's a good chance that then you have an argument. But sometimes, in the example given on the screen, since World War II there have been many advances in medicine, this since doesn't mean a premise indicator, right? It means from the time of, right? So since can have multiple meanings, and we have to be clear about what those meanings are so that we are aware when we see an indicator word and when we don't. Right? So in other words, since means from the time of, right? However, often passages expressing inferential relation among these statements contain an argument even if they have no indicator words, as we went over in 1.1. Right? Hackers who create virus should be severely punished. Computer viruses cause billions of dollars of damage and they destroy work. In other words, the conclusion is the first statement, right? And it's the conclusion to an argument even though we don't see any indicator words. On the other hand, if a passage qualifies as a typical kind of non-argument, then it does not contain an argument. So three typical kinds of non-argument, as they're covered in the book quite well with very good explanations, are warnings, pieces of advice, and then of course statements of belief or opinion. Often warnings, pieces of advice, and statements of belief contain merely a single sentence. So you don't see a conclusion developed by two premises that lead you to that conclusion. Rather, they are simply statements. So a warning puts someone on guard against a dangerous or detrimental situation. For example, watch out that you don't bump your head on that overhanging branch. Now, is that an argument? No. I could make an argument that says, watch out that you don't bump your head on that overhanging branch because that pain may cause you to lose work the next day or something like that, right? So you can use, a warning can be part of an argument, but it's not an argument all by itself. If no reasons are given to support the warning, then there's no argument. A piece of advice is slightly different. It makes a recommendation about some future decision or course of conduct. Before taking a class on a pass-fail basis, make certain that you know the minimum requirements for passing. Right? That starts to sound a little bit like an argument, but it's really just advice. Right? If no reasons are given to support the advice, then there is no argument. Right? A statement of belief or opinion expresses merely what somebody happens to think or believe about something. I think that Los Angeles is one great big freeway. We have all kinds of opinions all the time. And if we do nothing else in this class, it's to get us to be able to recognize what arguments are and to separate them out from opinions or statements of belief. Philosophy is about arguments. It is not about statements of belief. Your grandmother has opinions. Everybody has an opinion. But what we want are solid arguments backed up by solid premises. We will get to that when we get to the validity and soundness later on. So now let's look at some practice problems. People who pirate music from the internet are cutting off their own throats. By cheating recording artists out of their royalties, these pirates are driving the artists out of business. If the artists go out of business, there will be no more music. So how do we interpret this passage? Is it an argument? Is it a statement of belief or opinion? Or is it a piece of advice? Well, let's look at each sentence one by one and see if it's something like what a conclusion would be. People who pirate music from the internet are cutting their own throats. By cheating recording artists out of their royalties, these pirates are driving the artists out of business. If the artists go out of business, there will be no music. This seems to then lead me to believe that they are indeed cutting their own throats, which is an expression which means, obviously, that people who like music are, by doing this, are taking music away from themselves. Okay? So this would be an argument. Right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of this conclusion. Right? So what are the premises in the conclusion? As I suggest in 1.1, I always think that you should get to, when practicing, look for the conclusion first. People who pirate music from the internet are cutting their own throats, and then go and put in the premises by cheating recording artists, etc. And then, if the artists go out of business, there will be no music. Okay. Let's continue with another practice problem. I recommend, after you graduate, right? Sounds like already like a piece of advice, right? I recommend something. That you take advantage of the luxury of choice that a college education offers and do what you love best in life, even if it is unfashionable. So how is this passage best interpreted? Is it an argument, a piece of advice, or a warning? Well, there seems to be no reason given that you take advantage of the luxury of choice that a college offers and do what you love best in life, even if it's unfashionable. You're not told why that ought to be the case. So it's not an argument, but it's not a warning either, right? There are no dangers ahead. It's a piece of advice. Okay? It's telling you about a future decision or course of action. A warning does so too. Watch your head. That's future-oriented as well, but advice is much more obvious. So the Department of Agriculture Department uses one standard for ground beef, while poultry products are allowed almost 6 times more salmonella positives. There's no standard for pork or sausage. We hope to see this useless policy reformed. How is this passage best interpreted? Is it a piece of advice? Is it a statement of belief or opinion? Or is it an argument? Well, we don't see that there's no standard for pork or sausage. We don't hear anything about why a policy is useless, right? So it's a statement of belief or opinion, okay? It merely expresses what somebody believes about something. And again, this could be hard to tell from regular arguments. But again, these premises do not lead you to any particular conclusion. Here's another practice problem. Many diseases have genetic causes. adoptive children have a right to information about diseases they may contract. Thus, adopted children have a right to know the identity of their birth parents. Now here, you'll notice that we have one of those words that tells us to look for a conclusion. And so we see what I think are two premises and then a conclusion. Right? This is an argument that adopted children have a right to know the identity of their birth parents. It's not a statement of belief. You're given reasons for thinking this is the case. Okay? Evidence or reasons are given in support of this conclusion. Thus is a conclusion indicator. So again, let's go put in our conclusion first. Right? Adopted children have a right to know the identity of their birth parents. Why? Because many diseases have genetic causes, and adopted children, trying to get to it. Adopted children have right to information about diseases that they may contract. How would they get to know that? They would have to know the identity of their birth parents. Occasionally, I should say, I may slip up and hit the wrong button and so on, but that itself will be a learning experience as you're going through this recording. Margie, whatever you do, do not enter an elevator alone with Fast Fingers Fred. That's quite a nickname to have, and probably not one used since the 1950s, but the point here is, obviously, this is what? An argument? No reason is given, right? It's not said that Fred has been known to be on elevators and to, put his hands on women. I heard about this just last week. Therefore, whatever you do, never enter an elevator. No, this is merely one sentence, right? It's not a statement of belief or opinion, right? Although an opinion certainly, the friend of Margie certainly has an opinion about Fred, it's a warning, right? The passage merely puts someone on guard against a dangerous or detrimental situation. So now let's look at two more kinds of arguments, non-arguments, loosely associated statements and reports. Loosely associated statements are statements about the same general subject, but they lack a claim that one of them provides for support for one or the other. In other words, the statements are loosely on the same subject, but not one that inferentially leads to a conclusion. Right? Love is the one thing that everybody wants to give and receive. Love is not identical to sex, but may be closely related. Mature loves involve mutual respect and shared values. Unconditional love is confined to the love parents have for their children. In this example, as you see, no statement is claimed to provide support for any of the others. Hence, there is no argument. And a report is a group of statements that seeks to convey information about some topic or event. Havana is prepared to hold talks with American companies that had property seized when Fidel Castro came to power 50 years ago, a United States Chamber of Commerce representative said after a trip to Cuba. This passage is not an argument because there is no claim that evidence or reasons that support a conclusion. It is merely reporting. This is something that you might see in a newspaper article, right? But literally reporting. Some reports can contain arguments, and this makes it a little bit difficult. This is where the book attempts to be a little bit tricky to trip you up. But a World Bank representative said that people in sub-Saharan Africa were living less well than they did in the 1960s because they have been devastated by war, corruption, and disease. So in other words, the World Bank representative is giving an argument, but this is a report of an argument. In other words, the author is not giving the argument him or herself. It's the person is merely reporting it. This passage reports an argument made by a World Bank representative, right? And you can see the premise indicator, right? The conclusion is they are living less well than they did in the 60s. Why? Because they've been devastated. Here's the premise: by war, corruption, and disease. However, since the reporter who authored this is not making the argument, reports of arguments should not be taken as arguments. This happens on Twitter and Facebook and so on all the time. People often share arguments that other people are making. And one thing that you need to be able to do, is we have to separate merely reporting an argument that somebody else is making, right, from actually making that argument. So if the New York Times or the Times Picayune Press or another newspaper organization or the media report the beliefs of somebody or report an argument that somebody is making, that is different than them making the argument themselves, right? And this gets into a lot of arguments about so-called media bias and so on, and that's an important topic in media ethics, and certainly a huge topic of concern for anybody interested in our civic culture and so on. But we must learn to separate out the reporting of something, the reporting of an argument, and even the reporting of an opinion sometimes, from actually having that, right? So if somebody retweets something, constantly you'll see this on Twitter, that they then have to go back and say, I didn't, that wasn't my opinion, I just thought it was an interesting argument even though I don't support it, right? The same thing on Facebook and whatever else the new technology that comes down may be. In addition to news reports, there are many other kinds, including historical reports, scientific reports, business reports, and so on. The kinds of things you'll be writing in your other classes. You might be writing an historical report. You might be writing a scientific report. You might be writing a business report. The difference is, though, often in your other classes, is that you will not only be expected to, say, report on something historically or scientifically or in business or so on, but then you'll be expected to make an argument as well, right? It was the case that the stock market crash was caused in 2007 and 2008 was caused by X. Here are the reasons. And so it's not just going to be reporting, it's going to be also making an argument. In any essay, you're overall trying to make an argument. So let's go through some practice problems. Art is anything you could hang on a wall. Art is whatever makes a statement. Art shocks people. Art engages the emotions. Art stimulates the senses. Art makes people think. How is this passage best interpreted? Is there any relationship between any of these statements? No. They're loosely associated statements. How are they associated? They're all about art. It is essential that levels of arsenic in drinking water be kept to a minimum. Arsenic causes lung, skin, and bladder cancer. It also causes diseases of the liver, blood vessels, and other organs. So as usual, my recommendation for you is to always look at the first or last sentence of each paragraph. That is normally, not all the time, where you'll find the conclusion. So let's look at the first sentence. It is essential that levels of arsenic in drinking water be kept to a minimum. And then you might go, why? It causes lung, skin, and bladder cancer, premise one. It also causes diseases of the liver, blood vessels, and other organs. In other words, this is best interpreted as an argument. All right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of a conclusion. So again, first step first, let's go put in our conclusion. It's essential that the levels of arsenic in drinking water be kept to a minimum. Why? Because arsenic causes lung, skin, and bladder cancer. Why else? It also causes diseases of the liver, blood vessels, and other organs, right? So you start with the conclusion, you go, why would that be the case? Premise one, premise two. So here's another practice problem. Human growth hormone combined with a high-protein diet significantly eased the symptoms of Crohn's disease in 3/4 of the patients with moderate to severe cases. Symptoms were eased to a lesser extent in patients with mild cases. How is this passage best interpreted? Well, it's not loosely associated statements. It's not saying human growth hormone combined with high-protein diet is good for baseball players who were taking them 10 years ago, I guess. It's not loosely associated. So is it an argument? No. What would be the conclusion here? Right? It's a report. It is something that you would read in a scientific report. Right? They all convey information about the treatment of Crohn's disease. So here's another practice problem. When a biotech company is issued a patent on a gene, the company can keep information on that gene secret. Also, it can sue any scientist who experiments on that gene without its permission. It follows that, right? We've seen that terminology before from 1.1, right? A conclusion indicator. Patents should not be issued on genes. So is this inferential? Yes, it is. One leads to the other, leads to the conclusion. So it is not a loosely associated statement, and it's certainly not simply a report, but rather is an argument. Right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of a conclusion. So let's go to that conclusion. Patents should not be issued on genes. Why? When a biotech is issued a patent on a gene, the company can keep information on the information secret. It can sue any scientist who experiments on that gene without its permission. Therefore, patents should not be issued on genes. And this has been a huge argument, for example, in biomedical ethics. So let's take up another practice problem. The case of a man convicted in Texas for a murder in 1997 should be reviewed by the Supreme Court, since his defense lawyer slept through significant portions of the trial, said a spokesman for Human Rights Watch. How is this passage best interpreted? Well, there does seem to be an argument here. We do have the word since, which is an indicator, right, that one finds in arguments, right? But is it an argument? No. The quotation marks tell us that this is a report. Somebody's reporting for a spokesman for Human Rights Watch, which is a human rights organization. So it's not loosely associated statements. It is a report of an argument. Okay. Now, there are two more kinds of non-arguments: expository passages and illustrations. And it's often difficult to distinguish these forms of expression from arguments. An expository passage is a form of expression that begins with a topic sentence, followed by one or more sentences that develop that topic sentence. So example here is, marine experts recommend many measures to promote ocean life. We should reduce the carbon dioxide levels, etc., etc. Right? We should better regulate commercial fishing, and so on. We should also reduce sound pollution caused by oil and gas exploration. But you wouldn't go, therefore marine experts recommend many measures to promote ocean life. No, it's an expository passage. In other words, it's telling you why they recommend this, but it's not making an argument why we should promote ocean life. Right? Everything after the first sentence develops the meaning of measures to promote ocean life. So caution, it may be difficult to determine if the sentences that follow the topic sentence merely develop its meaning or also prove it. If the subsequent sentences prove the topic sentence, then the passage is an argument. An illustration, on the other hand, is a statement about some subject with a reference to one or more specific instances that exemplify the meaning of the first statement. In other words, it gives a definition. All right? So it's an illustration. Right? A prime number is any number divisible by itself and 1. Thus, 2, 5, and 7, 11, and 13 are prime numbers. It's not an argument. It's not a premise in an argument. It's saying, it's basically an illustration is, here are examples of what we're talking about in the first sentence. The purpose of the second sentence is to provide a concrete example, not exemplification, that's a bit too wordy, an example of what prime numbers are. Here are some examples. Thus does not indicate that something is being proved, but rather that here are some examples based upon the first sentence. So examples can also be given to prove something. The result is an argument from example, and we'll get to this later on. So to distinguish an illustration from an argument, you must determine if the instances given are intended merely to pin down the meaning of something, that is an explanation, or to prove something. And if it's to prove something, then it's an argument. So let's go through some practice problems. The paintings of Johannes Vermeer reveal several distinguishing characteristics. There is the mastery of light and texture, the layering of paint to enhance a given mood, the sophisticated command of perspective, and the artist's awareness of the psychological impact of color. So how should we best interpret this passage? On the one hand, it doesn't seem to lead to a conclusion, right? There is no therefore. They reveal several distinguishing characteristics. Is it expository or is it an illustration? Right? There are several distinguishing characteristics. Right? It's given expository relationship to that first sentence. Always look at that first sentence. All that the rest of the passage does is develop the case that it's several distinguishing characteristics. I should pause here and say this, that my main task for having you do 1.2 and look at arguments versus non-arguments is so that at the end of the day, you can not perhaps remember the difference between although you'll need to do this for the quiz, that is important, but the main important thing is to be able to distinguish what is an argument versus what is not an argument. And that's why we're going through these different examples, but the whole purpose of this chapter is to get you to understand what it makes an argument and what doesn't. Okay? So here's another practice problem. Cigarette companies have known for years that their products kill its users. They've also known that tobacco is addictive. Consequently, people whose lives have been ruined by smoking have a right to collect damages from cigarette makers. Now, how should we best interpret this paragraph? Well, obviously we have something important here, which is the word consequently, which we know to be a conclusion indicator from 1.1. And do these two sentences, cigarette companies have known for years, and they also know that tobacco is addictive, lead you to this conclusion? Are they inferential? Indeed, I believe that they are. It's not an expository passage. Let's try that. No, the first sentence is not a topic sentence that is developed by the remainder of the passage. It's not an illustration. No examples are given of anything. But rather, it's an argument leading you to believe that people whose lives have been ruined by smoking have a right to collect damages from cigarette makers. It's interesting, though, at one time that this argument actually had to be made and was largely answered 20 years ago in the 1980s. Cigarettes are still allowed to be sold, but as you know, come with all kinds of warnings and even pictures of cancerous lungs and so on the packages. So this is an argument where you have a sentence: people whose lives have been ruined by smoking have a right to collect damages from cigarette makers. And then you can go, why? Cigarette companies have known for years this, and they have also known this. Right? So if you get a sentence where you can go, why, blah, 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 you get in an argument. So let's go back and put that conclusion in. They have the right to collect damages from their cigarette makers. Why? Because cigarette companies have known for years that their products kill its users. And they have also known that that tobacco is addictive. So let's try another practice problem. Combining herbal medicines with prescription drugs can be hazardous. For example, St. John's wort can cause confusion and nausea when taken with Prozac. So first, we can think of this as two things. Perhaps it's an illustration, or perhaps it's an argument. Okay? So the can be hazardous isn't saying that all herbal medicines with prescription drugs can be hazardous. But it's merely saying that it can be hazardous. Right? So we get what could be either an argument from an example or what would be an illustration. So let's see if it's an illustration. No. The example given is intended not to merely illustrate the meaning of something. Well, why is it not an expository paragraph? Why isn't this, just providing us, why are we not just getting examples that provide for this? Well, the example given is intended not merely, It's an argument. So, I gotta click OK. Sorry. Why is it not exposed to topic? Well, the first sentence is not a topic sentence that is developed by the remainder of the passage. Right? It's not a topic sentence that then is, you get lots of examples. No. It's an argument. This passage is an argument from example. And I know that's going to be difficult, right? Because you get expository passages which gives you examples, illustrations give you examples, and here you have an argument from example. But this example, St. John's wort can cause confusion and nausea when taken with Prozac. Premise. Conclusion, combining herbal medicines with prescription drugs can be hazardous. So there is something called the argument from example. We use this all the time, right? Do not drink that water. The 3 times, these are examples I'm giving, that I drank from that water, I became sick later. Right? Conclusion, followed by a premise. So let's look at that conclusion. Combining herbal medicines with prescription drugs can be hazardous, and let's put in that premise. St. John's wort can cause confusion and nausea when taken with Prozac. So, again, another practice problem. A noble gas is a gas that does not react with other elements or compounds. Thus, helium, neon, argon, and xenon are noble gases. How is this passage best interpreted? Okay, so we get thus, which seems to be a conclusion indicator. So let's see, is it an argument? No. No evidence or reasons are given in form of anything. The word thus in this context is not a conclusion indicator. It is, in fact, an illustration, right? The examples illustrate the meaning of what a noble gas is. So 2 final types of non-arguments: explanations and conditional statements. An explanation is a group of statements that supports to shed the light on some event or phenomenon. The Federal Reserve Bank was created many years ago because the system was needed to regulate the quantity of currency available to business community in response to growth or the contraction of the economy. Now I should say, this looks very close to a report. But notice what happens in an explanation, right? This first sentence, nobody, right? The first part of the sentence, we get because, which would seem to be part of an argument, but nobody would disagree with this, that the Federal Reserve Bank was created many years ago. In fact, it was created in the 1930s after the Great Depression. All right? We do get the word because, but it does not indicate that anything is being proven. Rather, something is simply being explained. Why was this done? Because of this. So to distinguish an explanation from an argument, look at the statement that might be the conclusion. Right? Usually, again, the first or the last statements, right? And if this statement asserts accepted matter of fact, the passage is probably an explanation. Nobody needs to make an argument that the Federal Reserve Bank was created many years ago. It's an accepted historical fact, right? Just as we might say, now there are other things where an argument might need to be made. We should never have fought the Vietnam War because blah, 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 right? And then there will be people that will continue to argue that they're for having gotten into the Vietnam War 50 years later. So there are still matters of controversy, but that the Federal Reserve Bank was created many years ago for this particular purpose is not one of them. Okay? So a conditional statement has an if-then in it. If interest rates rise, then home sales decline. And so this is a good time to say what follows the word if is the antecedent. What follows the word then, and it always will be in this form, is called the consequent. So a consequent is a consequence. A consequence usually always follows something. So just remember consequent, and then you know antecedent. If you know, if you've taken ancient languages, you know ante means before, like antebellum is before the war, right? So if interest rates rise, then home sales decline. Okay. Another thing to note here, right? You will almost never see an argument that takes up merely one sentence. So an if-then statement could be part of an argument, but it is merely one sentence. Okay? Just like an opinion often is one sentence, or a warning is watch your head is one sentence, or a piece of advice. Don't go with Fast Fingers Freddy, I guess was it, into that elevator. These are sort of quick sentences, not arguments. So a single conditional is not an argument, right? If interest rates rise, then home sales decline. It seems to be, then, gives you this, but we don't know if either of these are true, and a conditional statement are not arguments because they don't assert that either the antecedent or the consequent is true. If you hear a ding in the background, it means that someone's attempted to call me or something. That will happen. I'm sorry. I don't have a pause button, by the way, for this recording, oddly enough, because then it creates a whole new recording. So you'll just have to get the surprise every once in a while of me being texted that apparently I went to Seattle once and I saw the Space Needle. Okay, so we have conditional statements. That's what somebody was telling me by phone. If in an argument, the premises in our conclusion are claimed to be true, okay? But the relationship between if and then, if tells you everything. It might be the case, or it might not, right? But remember, a conditional statement can be a premise and also a conclusion. We will get to this. So let's work some problems involving these ideas. It is likely that innocent Americans have been executed in the recent past. During the past 25 years, 87% of innocent women, 87% innocent women and men have been released. Now, this is saying it is likely that innocent Americans have been executed in the recent past. Is this a generally accepted, no holds barred, pretty much anybody who knows, fortunately, it is still being argued that innocent Americans have been, whether they have been executed in the recent past. And so it is not simply an explanation, right? Because no statement here purports to shed light on an accepted fact. But you will, in every, I think, in every conditional statement you will get for at least the time being, you will get if. You may not get then, but the then is implicit. It is indeed an argument, right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of a conclusion, right? It is likely that innocent Americans have been executed in the recent past. Why? During the last 25 years, 87 innocent men and women have been released. In fact, the number is much higher than this, from death row as a result of evidence that turned up after they were convicted. Okay? So, the conclusion is, it is likely that innocent Americans have been executed in the recent past. Why? Because during the last 25 years, 87 innocent men and women have been released from death row. In fact, it's been I think almost 1,000, if not more, in the last 15 years alone, especially since the development of DNA technologies and their use in courts beginning in the early 1990s. Okay. Again, that is not an argument for or against the death penalty. Notice I didn't make an argument, and therefore that we should not have the death penalty. There might be people that argue, and maybe I'm trying to as best as possible to avoid political opinions being sprouted back and forth. What we're looking for is arguments, right? If the sentence had begun with, it is the case that, in fact, that premise can be used to say, we should abolish the death penalty. Why? It is likely that innocent Americans have been executed in the recent past, a number of innocent people from death row. So you could be led to that conclusion, right, from a set of premises that are contained here in this argument. But that argument is not being made here, okay? So let's look at some practice problems. We're going to have 15 of them. If commercial fishing practices are not changed, then leatherback turtles, whose numbers in the Pacific have plunged in recent years, will all but disappear in recent decades. Notice what we have here. We have an if and then we have a then. We have a conditional statement. Okay? That one is rather easy and straightforward, I would hope. Here's another practice problem. Again, there are plenty of practice problems in the text. If you were having any particular issues with the text, I'm willing to give you sets of answers. You just have to give them to me, and I can give you in an email the answers to sets of questions if you need additional practice. Women experience morning sickness during the first 3 months of pregnancy because, we have an indicator word, this condition prevents the woman from eating foods that could damage the fetus during the period when it is most vulnerable to injury. How is this passage best interpreted? Is it an argument? Is it an explanation? Is it a conditional statement? Well, it's not a conditional statement because we don't have an if-then there. Is it an argument? Well, let's see. Is there anything attempting to be proved? Right? Is this something we generally accept? Women experience morning sickness during the first 3 months of pregnancy. Now there too, like in an argument, I might go, why? But this is different. These premises do not lead to this conclusion, right? No statement is intended to prove anything. The fact that pregnant women experience morning sickness is an accepted fact. An unfortunate fact, but an accepted one, and therefore it's an explanation. Okay? The second statement sheds light on why pregnant women experience morning sickness. Here is another practice problem. If India is to enter the world business community, it must modernize its legal system. At the current pace, it would take over 400 years to hear the cases that have been filed to date. This situation is deadly for international trade. So how is this best interpreted? Right? We do have an if, then, a conditional there. But an if, then statement, a conditional statement, can be part of an argument. Right? So is it just merely a conditional statement? Yes, but a conditional statement can be a premise or it can be a conclusion. Is it merely an explanation? No. Nothing is purporting to shed light on any accepted fact. What would be an accepted fact here? Right? Now you might say this is an accepted fact. It would take over 400 years, but we would need any more explanation. This seems to be leading us to say if it wants to modernize, it must enter the world business community, it must modernize its legal system. This is making an argument. Right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of a conclusion. So let's look at the conclusion. If India is likely to enter the world business community, it must modernize its legal system. Then let's go to the premise. At the current pace, it would take over 40 years to hear the cases that have been filed to date. And we go to the second premise. The situation is deadly for international trade. Right? In other words, international trade that would come into India. So remember, when deciding whether a passage is an explanation or an argument, find the statement that might be the conclusion. If the statement asserts a generally accepted fact, the passage is probably an explanation. Right? If it is not a generally accepted fact, if you know people who don't believe that, right? Maybe people are arguing about global climate change, maybe people are arguing about other things that are controversial, abortion, etc., then we know that that is not something that is a generally accepted fact. In other words, as this well puts it, in real-life situations, most people do not try to prove what people already know. So let's finally do some practice problems involving the whole group of non-arguments. Last week, 116,000 fellow citizens joined the ranks of the unemployed, and the worshippers in the temples of commerce rejoiced. To me, this is true voodoo economics. Now, you don't have an expository statement. There's no argument. Why? Because there's no relationship between this statement and this statement. Voodoo economics is a reference from the 1980s forward, first used by Vice President, who was to become George H.W. Bush, to reference what became known as trickle-down economics. That is, if you cut taxes for the wealthy, that the benefits of that will trickle down to the lower middle classes. Leaving that aside, an argument, obviously somebody wants to talk about this is true voodoo economics, but this is non-expository passage. Is it an argument? No. No evidence or reasons are given in support of anything. We're told that there's a number of unemployed, right? Join the ranks of the unemployed. But this could be for a number of different reasons. For example, it's often the case that, and this is not to argue for or against a certain kind of economics, I'm putting that aside, but we could think of other reasons why there might be 116,000 citizens who become unemployed. For example, each January, it's known that the unemployment rate goes up. That is, 100, perhaps as many as 116,000 or more people are laid off after the holidays for a couple of reasons. A, they may have been seasonal Christmas and holiday workers. Retail businesses hire more people during that time. Also, businesses tend to put off terminating people until after the holidays. You seem kind of Scrooge-like if you do that, right? That might be another reason, right? So if this is in January, this wouldn't be an argument. This is just a statement of opinion. So it's quite appropriate that corporations that abuse their status as monopolies can be broken up. This is starting to sound like a conclusion, right? Right? Somebody's arguing for this. Abusive monopolies. So now let's look to see if these are reasons developing that. Abusive monopolies stifle competition, which makes for higher consumer prices. Also, they smother innovation, which restricts the range of products available to the consumer. So how is this best interpreted? Well, I've already sort of suggested to you, right? It's not a piece of advice, right? It's not just merely advice that companies that abuse their power should become broken up. It's not a statement of belief or an opinion, because it gives reasons for that. Abusive monopolies stifle competition. This is well known in economic theory. And when there's these monopolies, they smother innovation. Right? And so in economic theory, this is a well-known thing that we want to avoid monopolies. Otherwise, they take over an entire marketplace and then can set whatever prices they wish. This is indeed an argument. And again, I said that this is well known in economic theory, but this is an argument giving for why there should not be monopolies. Right? Evidence or reasons are given in support of that conclusion. So, it is quite appropriate that corporations that abuse their status as monopolies be broken up. There are people that argue against that. It's not generally accepted. So, we have to say why. Abusive monopolies stifle competition, and we might say that they smother innovation, which restricts the range of products available to the consumer. So here's another practice problem. It is well established that boys do better in geography than girls. The reason for this is that knowledge of geography depends on the ability to read maps, and boys have better spatial skills than girls. I wish I had taken this out. But never mind. Let's deal with it as it is, this argument, that it is well established that boys do better than girls. Now you might think it's what? An explanation, right? And it is. It's an explanation because why is it that boys do better in geography than girls? Supposedly, because they have better spatial skills than girls. That may or may not necessarily be the case, but an argument is being made. We're going to talk about this later, but what we're looking at now is the argument form, not its content, not whether its premises are true, not whether what it says in it is true or not. We're merely trying to look at what an argument is. And then later on, look at whether the argument is sound. Is the premise true? And if the premise isn't true, then the argument itself cannot be true. But we will get there. Learning occurs when practice or experience leads to a relatively permanent change in behavior potential. Operant learning occurs as a function of the consequences of behavior. social learning occurs through observation of others' behavior. So how is this passage best interpreted? Right? Learning occurs when practice or experience leads to a relatively permanent change in behavior potential. Right? That doesn't seem to be what this is saying. Why operant learning? Now we seem to be talking about something different. Okay? So it's not an argument, right? No evidence or reasons are given in support of anything. It's not a conditional statement. There's no if or then. So it's a merely loosely associated statements about learning. So here is another practice problem. The war on drugs has been waged disproportionately against blacks. Now this seems, right, something that is not generally agreed upon. It may be agreed upon by all your friends, it may be agreed upon by your political party or something else, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily agreed upon by others. Okay, the war on drugs has been waged disproportionately against blacks. Right? Twice as many, so it's not an explanation, because this is not universally accepted. Right? It's not something like a statement of fact of the central bank was set up because twice as many blacks as whites have been in prison for drug use, and while there are 5 times more drug users, and there are 5 times more drug users, white drug users, than black ones. So how is this passage best interpreted? Well, obviously I'm suggesting it's best interpreted as an argument. These 2 premises lead to that conclusion. Right? So let's load this up. So we say the conclusion is the first sentence. Okay, so we get another practice problem. A conifer is a tree that retains its foliage during the winter months. Thus pines, firs, spruces, and cedars are conifers. Right? What does this look like to you? Is it an argument? No, there's no argument being made. There's no inference. We do get the thus there, though. Is it an explanation? Well, it's not explaining why this is the case. It's an illustration. Pines, spruces, and cedars are conifers. Why? Because they retain their foliage during the winter months. It's definitional. When you're looking at an illustration, it's definitional. Right? The examples cited illustrate the meaning of what conifer means, in case you wanted to know. So here's another practice problem. Attendants aboard cruise ships have lives filled with hardship. They work 14-hour days. Also, they earn less than $2 per hour. They sleep in cramped quarters, and they never get to visit their relatives and friends. How is this passage best interpreted? Well, it's not really a warning. There's nobody here saying, don't become an attendant aboard a cruise ship. It's not an expository passage, right? Why? Because this seems to be leading us towards that argument. Attendants aboard cruise ships have lives filled with hardship. Now, that may be the case, right? But you need to make an argument for it, and that's what these sentences or premises are meant to do, is to lead us to believe that. Because it could be the case that others look at attendants aboard a cruise ship and say, hey, you're not really working, you're out on a cruise ship, and yes, you may be swabbing a deck, but you're outside in the air or whatever, and that's not desperate, right? So it's not merely expository, right? It's an argument. Evidence or reasons are given in support of that conclusion. So, let's go to the conclusion. They have lives filled with hardship. Why? Because they work 14-hour days. Because they earn less than $2 per hour. Because they never get to visit their relatives and friends. And they sleep in cramped quarters. Right? So notice this is a little bit of a longer argument, right? 3 premises and then a conclusion. So here's another practice problem. The dwarf planet Pluto was discovered by Clyde Tombaugh in 1930. Its diameter is about 1/5 of that of the Earth. Its orbit around the Sun is more elongated than that of any other planet, and it requires 248 years to complete it. Pluto has one relatively large satellite named Charon. It's not an argument, because it's merely what? Is it trying to tell you something about Pluto, which is no longer considered a planet? Is it a report or about the planet Pluto? You could see that this would be the case if you flipped to you know, an astronomy textbook and a section in it. So here's another practice problem. An anti-ballistic missile defense will not work because no method has been devised to distinguish oncoming enemy warheads from decoys. How is this best interpreted? Well, this sounds like something can't be an explanation. Why? Because this is not something that has been generally accepted, that we can't develop an anti-ballistic missile defense system. It can't be an illustration because it doesn't give us an anti-ballistic missile and has X qualities. Hence, these are types of anti-ballistic missiles. It's an argument, a shorter one than the previous one, right? Evidence or reasons is given for the first part of the sentence, right? Again, you have because in there, and that's a premise indicator, right? So let's do the premise first. No method has been devised to distinguish oncoming enemy warheads from decoys, and that's why an anti-ballistic missile defense will not work. Obviously, if you can't distinguish between decoys and actual warheads, you can't have an working anti-ballistic missile defense system. So here's another practice problem. If young entrepreneurs spend all of their time learning how to make money and none of their time cultivating the arts and humanities, then they have nothing genuinely rewarding to spend their money on after they earn it. So how is this best interpreted? Is this an argument? It sounds like one, right? It sounds like young entrepreneurs, if they do that, then this will happen, right? It's not loosely associated because they do seem to, one goes right into the other. But it's a conditional statement. If, then. If, then. No matter how long it is, how many words are used in the statement, it is still an if-then conditional statement, right? It's a single conditional statement. Okay. Again, it looks like it would be an argument, right? And rhetorically, it might be a statement of opinion by somebody, but it is indeed just a conditional statement. A healthy lifestyle involves a few simple directives. Avoid tobacco products, get regular exercise, develop good sleeping habits, include plenty of vegetables in your diet, reduce the intake of fat, and eliminate the consumption of pesticides, herbicides, and food additives, right? So, is this an argument? Well, let's see. Now, no evidence is given in support of anything, right? It doesn't say do this and then you'll have, therefore you have a healthy lifestyle. Is it an illustration? No. No examples are cited that illustrate anything. It's an expository passage. The first sentence is the topic sentence, and the remainder develops that. What is involved in, what are the simple directives that involve a healthy lifestyle? Now we get to what will take you a bit of practice with questioning. Necessary and sufficient conditions. A is said to be a sufficient condition for B whenever the occurrence of A is all that is needed for B. Let's get rid of the letters for now. Being a wolf is a sufficient condition for being an animal. Okay? That's all that's needed. If you're a wolf, you're an animal. Right? This idea can be expressed in a conditional statement. If something is a wolf, then it is an animal. On the other hand, something is said to be a necessary condition for A whenever A cannot occur without the occurrence of B. So, being an animal is a necessary condition for being a wolf. Now, if you're an animal, you may not be a wolf. But in order to be a wolf, you have to have already been an animal. It's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. So, it can be expressed as such. If something is not an animal, then it is not a wolf. Right? If something is, you could also fill that in with other things. If it is not an animal, then it is not a bird. If it is not an animal, it is not a mouse. If it is not an animal, etc. Right? Being an animal is a necessary condition for being a mouse, a cat, a dog, and so on. Being an animal is a necessary condition for being a wolf, and this idea can be expressed in the conditional statement. And if something is not an animal, then it is not a wolf. But it is equivalent to saying if something is a wolf, then it is an animal. Both are equally true. Thus, every conditional statement expresses both a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. The first one, being a wolf, is a sufficient condition for being an animal. If one is a wolf, then one is an animal. Being an animal is a necessary condition for being a wolf. Okay? So let's now do some problems. Okay? Again, the notion of necessary and sufficient conditions are used all the time. Spilling red wine on a white shirt is a necessary or sufficient condition for producing a stain. Right? If it's necessary, you need at least this. And if it is sufficient, it is all that's needed. Right? Yes, spilling the red wine on the shirt is all that is needed to produce the stain. Okay? You don't need anything else. That's what sufficient means. Right? Select a conditional statement that expresses this condition. If you spill red wine on a white shirt, then you produce a stain. If you produce the stain on a white shirt, then you spilled red wine on it. Well, if you produce a stain on a white shirt, then you spilled red wine on it. Well, that's not quite true. If you have a stain on a white shirt, that could have happened a number of different ways. However, if you spill red wine on a white shirt, then you will produce a stain. So here's another practice problem. Connecting with the ball is a necessary or sufficient condition for hitting a home run. Okay. Is it all that is needed for hitting a home run, which would be sufficient? Or is it necessary, meaning it's the least you would need to be able to do? If you don't connect with the ball, then you can't hit a home run. Now, of course, with it being a necessary condition, we recognize there might be other conditions needed. You need to hit it on the right place in the bat, and so on, right? Sufficient says that's all that's needed. Necessary condition is just one of the things that's needed for that to occur. So, so let's look at these conditional statements that express this condition. If you get a home run, then you hit the ball. If you hit the ball, then you get a home run. Well, of course, we know this is not the case. If you hit a ball in baseball, you don't necessarily get a home run. But if you get a home run, then you necessarily hit the ball. Okay? So, lifting the tab on a can of Coke is a necessary or sufficient condition for drinking the contents. Right? So again, if it's necessary, it's all that is needed for B. And sufficient, if it's necessary, it's the least you need to do for it. And it's sufficient, it is all that is needed. Right? So lifting the tab, is that all that is needed? Is it sufficient? No. You obviously have to raise it to your head, and et cetera, et cetera. It is a necessary condition. It's the least that you can do, right? So if you don't lift the tab, then you can't drink the contents. Of course, this assumes ordinary circumstances. So let's select the conditional statement that expresses this condition. If you lift the tab on a can of Coke, then you drink the can of the contents. Well, that might not be the case. In fact, while doing this exercise, I've lifted the tab on LaCroix water, and I've been waiting for quite a while to drink the contents, right, until finishing this lesson. If you drink the contents of a can of Coke, then you have lifted the tab. That is true. You can't do one without the other. Now, yes, you can have counterfactuals, like you could say, things that I've seen in movies or whatever, where somebody weirdly bites into a can of beer, and that's a thing, or that was a thing in 70s and 80s party movies, right? But let's just keeping this straightforward. If you drink the contents of the can of Coke, then you have lifted the tab. That is the general way that people drink cans of soda. So here's another practice problem. Throwing a raw egg against a wall is a blank condition for breaking it. Right? This one's tricky. So is it necessary? Right? Is it at least what is needed, or it is sufficient? Is it all that is needed? Well, throwing a raw egg is all that you would need for breaking it. It's a sufficient condition. Throwing a raw egg against a wall is all that is needed to break it. So if you throw an egg against a wall, then you will break it. If you break an egg, then you have thrown it against the wall. Well, no, that's not the case. Why? Because you could break an egg by hitting it up against the counter or hitting it up against the lip of a cup and so on, right? As we often do when we're making eggs. No, if you throw an egg against the wall, then you will break it. And so another practice problem. Writing a book is a blank condition for producing a bestseller. So if it is a necessary condition, right? If it is a necessary condition, it's the least you need to do. If it is sufficient condition, it's all you need to do. Well, if you write a book, that doesn't mean you're going to produce a bestseller. But it's necessary that you write the book in order to produce a bestseller. If you don't write the book, then it can't become a bestseller. Puncturing an inflated balloon is a condition for making it pop. Is it necessary or sufficient? Is it all that is needed? Yes, puncturing an inflated balloon is all you need to do to make it pop. In the textbook, there are numerous examples from real life and so on. Okay, and so thanks for going through 1.2 with me. We will now get out of this. All right. And I will now hopefully pause in this and say goodbye while you stop screen recording. So you'll see you'll get this at the end every once in a while. It's the stop screen recording, but thank you for doing 1.2 with me.